So this is finally it. For having a book of the Bible named after her, Esther has been largely absent from the story and completely silent up until now. We're almost halfway through the book and almost done with this series on Esther, and she has been little more than decoration up until now. She's won the favor of the king. She's had a banquet thrown in her honor. She's told the king about the assassination plot that Mordecai discovered. But this morning, this is actually the first time that we hear her voice. The tension of the story has been building to this moment. Last week, we were left with Ahasuerus and Haman. Just checking. You don't have to do it the whole time. Getting drunk and gorging themselves on food while shock of the edict spread throughout the city and the empire. And this morning, the crisis has reached a pinnacle. We see Mordecai react to the news by tearing his clothes, by putting on sackcloth and ashes, and wailing in the streets. This public display of lament. And this spectacle of his lament is just too much for Esther. So she sends out clothes for him to put on, to cover his shame. And here is where we see the true beauty of Esther's character come out. Now it seems as though at this point she hasn't yet heard about Haman's plot to kill the Jews. If she did, I don't think she would have asked Mordecai why he is causing such a scene. I imagine life in the palace was fairly sheltered and separate from the goings-on of the common folk. So it's not surprising that she hasn't heard the news, that she doesn't know why Mordecai is wearing sackcloth and wailing in the streets. All she knows right now is that he is drawing a lot of attention to himself. So I don't think anyone would have blamed her if she'd gotten angry at him for embarrassing her in such a way. She was royalty now, after all. So imagine how she would have felt about her adoptive father going around making a spectacle of himself and crying out against the king and the powers that be. If you're like me and can't help but follow the latest news out of Buckingham Palace, just think of this like the drama playing out between Meghan Markle and her father. Right? A father and a daughter separated by royal protocol and personal strife. So we wouldn't have blamed her if she had gotten angry. But that's not how she responds. She doesn't respond out of frustration or anger. She doesn't pretend not to know him or try to shush him up out of embarrassment. Instead, she is moved by compassion. We're told how she was overwhelmed with grief at seeing what he had become, and she reaches out to do what she can to ease his suffering. But he refuses her help. And when he does, she sends another attendant. She is not put off. She sends someone else to go and to figure out what is causing him to act in such a manner. And in response, Mordecai describes Haman's treachery. He sends Esther a copy of the edict, and he asks her to go before the king and plead the case of their people. Now, having not heard any of this, Esther is naturally caught off guard. Right? Hearing that your husband has been persuaded and conspired with his second in command to issue a decree ordering the extermination of your people is a lot to take in. So at first, all Esther can do is to sputter out some excuse. about how everyone knows that if you go before the king in the inner sanctuary, in the inner throne room, without being summoned, you can face death, if the king chooses so. Plus, she adds, the king hasn't wanted to see me in over a month, so chances are pretty slim that he'll want to see me now. This is a very real fear. But Mordecai responds to it with an empowering speech that gets to the heart of what is at stake. It's the stirring speech of a coach to an underdog team at halftime. It's the inspiring address of any leader in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Think of your favorite movie and the speeches that they give. This is Mordecai's moment. Don't fool yourself, he says, into thinking that just because you are in the imperial palace, you'll be the only Jewish person to escape. If you insist on remaining silent at this time, vindication and liberation will come to our people from another source. But both you and your family will surely die. Who is to say? You may have come into the royal court for such a time as this. For such a time as this. This is probably the most well-known and most often quoted line from the whole book of Esther. It's a phrase that calls us to take stock of all the times that have come before this moment and to make a decision about what comes next. In this moment, in this time, there is a fullness of time that cannot be ignored. This is your moment to do something. So what will you do with it? Mordecai's words to Esther have been used as a rallying cry for people of faith for millennium. The most recent utterance has come from a group of Christians who have organized rallies in conjunction with the annual meeting of the Southern Baptist Convention. These rallies, called For Such a Time as This Rally, have been organized to protest the failure of church leaders to hear the stories of women who have been abused and harassed by male pastors. In Esther, they find a fellow victim of abuse. A woman taken from her home and held captive by the most powerful man in the empire. So by asking Esther to go before the king, Mordecai was asking a whole lot of her. He was asking her to confront her abuser, to expose that which made her most vulnerable, and to do it all alone. Esther's excuse reveals her fear. But Mordecai's rebuttal is a reminder that hope lies on the other side of fear. He warns her that Haman's edict applies to her as well, that her death is guaranteed if she doesn't do anything. But if she can find the courage to face her fears, to move through them and past them, and to go before the king, there is where hope resides. It's easy to relate to Esther's fear because it's easier to give up without even trying. We make excuses for why a thing isn't possible before we even try because taking a risk or facing our fears is hard. Sometimes it's the fear of failure that holds us back. If we don't try, then we won't fail, right? But failure is guaranteed if you don't try. Mordecai's words remind us of this, that we will fail if we're not even willing to try. That not trying is really the only true failure. To save herself and her people, Esther had to face that which made her the most vulnerable, She had to confront the man that's controlled her story up until this point. She had to risk her life, and she had to reveal her Jewish identity. And here is where we see why this book is called Esther rather than Mordecai. Because it's here that Esther rises to the occasion and becomes the hero of her own story. Here is where Esther takes control of her life and moves beyond her fears. Instead of listening to her uncle or following the suggestions of the eunuch, instead of obeying the king, here Esther is the one making the plans and giving the orders. She resolves to go before the king, as Mordecai suggested, but she's going to do it on her own terms, and she's not going to do it alone. It's hard to do big and scary things on your own. And Esther realizes that we can do so much more together, that we can go so much farther together. Because there is solidarity, there is power in solidarity. So Esther commands Mordecai to get all the Jewish people of the city together to fast for her for 3 days. Day and night, no eating or drinking, to support her. She knows she needs the support of her people. And after 3 days of fasting, she will go before the king in defiance of the law and will suffer the consequences. If I perish, I perish. Esther's words of resolve are probably the second most well-known and second most quoted line from the book of Esther. Her words are an acknowledgement of stepping into the unknown, of daring to do something with this moment that she has been given, no matter the consequences. Because she realizes that daring to hope is better than doing nothing. And even though, as we have mentioned before, God is not referenced at all in this book, this is one of those times where I see the Spirit very much at work in the story. The same Spirit that prompted Vashti to refuse to appear before the king when summoned is the same Spirit that now empowers Esther to go before him unsummoned. Our reading this morning ends with resolve rather than resolution. And if you've read the whole story, you know what happens on the other side of this 3-day citywide fast. And just so we're consistent and we give as many people an opportunity to raise their hand as possible, how many of you know what happens on the other side of the fast? Excellent. All right. You have one more week to be able to raise your hand. I know you can do it. Because next week we will find some resolution in her story. But for now, we rest in her resolve. Her resolve to do something, to take ownership of her story, to confront her fears, to make herself vulnerable, and thereby become indomitable. So this morning, as we rest in Esther's resolve, I ask you to consider your own. Resolve that you have to do something in this moment, to make a change, to stand up or to speak out, to face your fears, to take a risk, to be more than the limits that you've placed on yourself or that others have placed on you. To ask yourself, how is the Spirit at work in you? Empowering you, preparing you for such a time as this. When faced with such time, with such moments, with such fullness, it is good to take a deep breath, to see the excuses that we build up for what they are, so that you can choose hope over despair, and you can dare to make a difference. The Spirit is waiting. Will you answer the call? Amen.